The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Unit 6 in the Lunch and Learn series. We're going to look at team culture this afternoon, and so I just wanted to do a quick sound check, make sure everything's working. Could you just type in the word clear over in the question box? That would just let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? Thanks, Marianne. Great. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, brilliant. I think it is occurring, which is great. So obviously you'll get a copy of the slides and the presentation. So for the last 2 months, we've been working together extensively, of course, on the Lunch and Learn series, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed certainly presenting and coordinating everything with you. So today we're looking at the interesting topic of culture, and the word culture is used a lot. I'm not sure people are completely clear about what it means, but every team has a culture. It has a unique culture to that team, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes as a team leader we can deliberately create that culture, and other times it can kind of just happen as a result of what we do, but we're just not aware of it. So we'll actually have a look at it in great detail today, and I'll give you some tips and hints on how to work at improving the culture of your team. So it's been a bit of a journey, as I said, over the last couple of months, and as you can see on the screen there, that's the summary of all of the units that we've done in the Lunch and Learn series, and I hope you've got something useful out of it. The whole purpose of this is to give you some tools to take away and to build and to develop your own team. So hopefully that's worked for you. So what I'm going to do, I won't go back and summarize the other 5 because it's probably worth just getting on and using the time valuably to talk about team culture. But having said that, I think it's worth just elaborating a little bit on last time we met, which was a fortnight ago, and we looked at conflict resolution and negotiation, and you'd be aware that there were 5 different approaches that we looked at in relation to conflict and negotiation. And the argument there, of course, was that it's important to use all 5 in different situations with different people, and not to be too caught up in one way. And of course, you had a little diagnostic to do, which demonstrated to you what your preferred style of conflict resolution was. And the point about that was not to use it too often, even though you may well be convinced that it's the right approach. It may not be in those circumstances. And I guess the other message that came out of the last session was, if plan A doesn't work, then try plan B or C or whatever. So in other words, use a variety of approaches. You'll be far more likely to resolve the conflict or win the negotiation if that's what you're attempting to do. And being a team leader, of course, you're placed in that position where you are constantly negotiating and dealing with conflict. So hopefully you found that very useful, and your homework, of course, was to go away and to practice using those 5 as much as possible. The interesting thing in the profile that you did is that the low scores that you got were possibly the ones to be mindful of, because they're the ones that you're probably least likely to favour. And because of that, you in a sense you are hamstrung, because what you're doing is, by not using those ones that you don't favour, then you are less versatile and will find it more difficult to deal with conflict only using a couple of approaches rather than all 5. So the point was, use all 5 as much as you can. So what are we covering today? So I'm going to look at what culture is, and we'll spend a bit of time just talking about that, because as I said earlier, people talk about culture all the time, but what does it actually mean? What I said that team's got a culture. What do I actually mean by that? So let's actually have a look and understand what that actually means. Obviously, I'll share with you a bunch of strategies around developing team culture, and what I suggest is you take one that works, one that you like the sound of, and go and work with it with your team. So that would be a good little project for next week. And I'm going to finish up the presentation talking about team identity. And I just in the process, as I've completed a manuscript for my 9th book, and it's coming out hopefully next year. And it's basically looking at team identity. And I've developed a new model around that, and I'll share that with you. So it's sort of, you've got it even before the books come out. So we'll be sharing that with you a little later. All right, so let's talk about culture. Let's talk about what we mean by culture. Now, here's a definition of culture. I mean, if you Google this, Google team culture definition, you would get myriad definitions, perhaps even in the millions. But this is one that might get us moving in the right direction, I think. So what I'm suggesting here is that culture is the basic pattern of shared assumptions, values and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities facing the team. So let's just unpack that a little bit. It is a pattern of behavior or thinking, so it is something that's recurring. So that's the first important thing about culture. It is also something that's considered to be correct, that is, correct in the context of the team. So it may not be correct in another culture, but within the team it's considered to be correct. And that's why it's fascinating, isn't it, to see these organisations around the world that are corrupt, and you think, how could that possibly be? Well, they have their own culture, and within that culture itself, that behaviour is considered to be correct. So if you take Enron in the United States, for example, which was clearly unethical in hindsight, obviously the people that worked there thought it was correct, and that's why they went ahead and did what they did. And it's also not just about what you do, it's also what you think. So culture actually involves thinking as well as behaviour. So it's a pattern of behaviour or thinking that is considered to be correct, might be another way of putting it. And when you look at culture, you'll find that some of it is very obvious, and then there's other parts that are not so obvious. So for example, if you take the iceberg, the old iceberg, which we're all familiar with, a small part of the iceberg is above the water line. So you see a small part of the iceberg. The majority of the iceberg is below the waterline. So basically what you can see above the waterline are very explicit characteristics of culture. And so as you can see there, it might be the physical way people set up their team. It might be the structures that are involved, how the meetings are run, are they using agendas, what sort of language is being used. I don't mean foreign language, I'm talking about key words and phrases. You'll actually can get to hear those. What rituals, what ceremonies are conducted in the team that might be unique to the team, what stories and legends, keep the team going. Now, all those things, if I came into your team next week and I sat down, I could actually probably within 20 minutes be able to give you a list of some of those overt characteristics of your team. But there are another lot of characteristics, and often more so, that are below the waterline, and these, of course, are the ones that we can't see on the surface. But if I was in the team for a period of time, of course, I would pick up on these things. So these are the beliefs, and these are the values and the assumptions that the team has working together. And so a new person to a team, their very first thing is to try and work out what is appropriate or inappropriate in terms of behaviour and thinking. So they spend a lot of time just watching in that first month or two and trying to understand what the culture of the team is before they decide perhaps to do anything, chance their arm, so to speak. So culture is there. The question that we've got to ask ourselves, of course, is not whether we have a culture. Of course we do. The question we've got to ask is the culture actually serving us well? And that's the question I want you to have a think about in your own team. Now, the question, why do we have a culture, is worth pondering. So why do we have to have a culture? Why can't we just not have a culture at all? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I want to run through those with you, starting at 12 o'clock here and moving clockwise. So having a culture is like a sense-making tool. So by having a culture, it means that the team themselves uh, understand what's appropriate, as I said before, inappropriate behavior or thinking. So it's a tool to make sense of what we should and shouldn't consider and do in a team. And people feel safe when they've got some boundaries around that. And in fact, that's the second key point, is that it helps define the boundaries around team behavior and thinking. So people want to know what those boundaries are when they first come into a team. Human beings need those boundaries, as I've mentioned several times through the Lunch and Learn. It's also an opportunity to create an identity. So not only does the team have an identity, but also the individual feels that they belong to an identity. So, a sense of identity or belonging. There's a commitment also that when you have a culture that, you've got a group of individuals that come together, those individuals can then start to think beyond themselves in terms of a team culture. So you've got a commitment beyond self, and that becomes important. There is also, because there's a culture there's a degree of stability in terms of predictable behavior and predictable ways of thinking, and people like stability. So you can see that human nature very much depends on culture in order to keep itself functioning fairly effectively. And that's the reason that we have a culture. So the question now is, how can we shape our culture to better suit the needs that we have for our team? So let's have a look. Now, one of the fun exercises I think you should try next time you've got a team meeting, and I can assure you, you will enjoy this and it works really well, is you ask 3 questions of your team. And what I'd suggest that you ask them to bring a pen and paper and or an iPad or whatever they're going to write with, and to actually record these answers. So the first question is, if you had to describe our team as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right, so the metaphor is a colour, and then people pick a colour and then they indicate why. Now you'll find this is incredibly interesting, and you'll get lots of interesting colours, but the most important thing, of course, is the why. So the second question is, if you had to describe our team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? All right, so they've got to pick an animal and then describe the reason, the metaphor of the animal. What does it mean? And the third one is, if you had to describe our team as a motor vehicle, what would it be and why? Now, you'll find this really, really fun to do and very interesting. And what you will find when you go around the room and you ask people to basically share what they saw as the colour, animal and vehicle, whilst they may be different, what you will find is very similar, the themes running around the room. So people in the team will have similar themes because they're observing the culture of the team, and that becomes very interesting. Let me give you an example. I did this with Queensland Rail, or QR, which is the railway authority in Queensland. I realise there are many of you interstate, but anyway, it's probably no different to any other sort of railway setup in the world. But it was going through a tough patch at the time, and I had a team and I asked them these 3 questions. And what I found interesting, and I got them to do it as a team. So what happened is they all got together and worked it out, and the colour that they picked was black. And of course I said why, and they said because we're not terribly exciting, we're highly regulatory, we're pretty boring, and things go missing. So there was the reason. And I said, what was your animal? And they said, an elephant. And they said because the elephant is slow to move and slow to change. And sometime there was another reason, that the elephant never forgets, so it carries grudges. So, and then I said, well, what about the vehicle? Now, in Queensland Rail at the time, I think it was something like in the order of 79% of people were male. 79% of employees were male. So it was a very male-dominated environment. It's changed a little bit, but not much. And so what also occurs there is that perhaps their father had worked there, and perhaps their grandfather had worked there as well. So they picked a Holden because it was kind of like a family sort of organisation, if you like. Now, that's a pretty dim view from a team. Now, I also did this exercise with IBM when they were in their heyday, and they were really top of the game, and it was a completely different colour, animal, and vehicle. The colour they picked was gold. I said, why? And they said, because we're number one, we're the best. The animal they selected was a cheetah, fast moving, agile, quick to change direction. Okay, and the vehicle was a Ferrari with all the bells and whistles, because we're number one and we produce the best product. Now, at the time, that was in fact the case, and so you had this incredible opinion in the team of what the culture of the team was as a result of that. So try it out in your team. It really works extremely well. It's a lot of fun. It'll take you about 20 minutes. And it's a hell of a lot better than just having a reporting process, a mindless reporting process. Have an exercise like that. Now, if you want to, you could actually then say to the team, if you find it's worthwhile doing, you could actually say, well, what would be the colour, animal, and vehicle that you would like it to be? So if it was in an ideal state, what would the colour, animal, and vehicle be? Now, there will obviously be a difference between what they said initially and what they said at the end. And then, of course, it opens up a dialogue around how do we get from A to B. So it's a very good exercise to do with your team, and you might like to try that one. You'll find a lot of funny comments and remarks, and it's just good fun. Now, if you don't like that and you think it's a bit frivolous, then you could try this, which is these are the 10 key dimensions of organisational culture from the work of Robbins. And I'm not going to run through them all there, but you can see them on your screen. And what you do is you ask your team to rate these on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is high, 1 is low, to the degree that they believe that that's present in their team. So, for example, take risk tolerance, which is number 2 on the list. That is the degree to which employees are encouraged to be innovative and risk-taking. All right, so that's the definition. Okay, so if people are encouraged to be entrepreneurial and willing to take risks, they might rate that team a 4 out of 5. If it was a government department, I suspect it probably wouldn't be a 4 out of 5, but it may well be a 1 out of 5. So it'll obviously depend on the industry, it'll depend on the organisation and so forth, but you can get people to do that, and then you can have a really useful discussion around some of the key indicators there and what you can do in order to improve those. So there's another exercise for you. This would be a little bit more formal, but nevertheless, it's just as effective, and it may well isolate some of the key stumbling blocks around becoming a high-performing team, some of the issues around a team culture that needs to be developed. So that's something you might like to look at. By the way, folks, the normal thing, if you've got any questions or any comments, you know what to do. Go to the question box and just type them in. And remember, I'm the only one that gets to see it, and I'll respond to it the moment I see it. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about an interesting concept from an article that was written by two people, O'Reilly and Tushman. It was several years ago, and they called the article The Ambidextrous Organisation, which I thought was a wonderful title. Now, you'd be aware, those of you who perhaps enjoy sport, as I do, what does ambidexterity really mean? Well, ambidexterity means that you could quite capably use your left or your right hand. So, for example, if you're a tennis player and you're an ambidextrous tennis player, then you could probably play tennis equally well right or left-handed. Or if you're a cricketer, you may be able to bat well or as capably right-handed or left-handed. So that's what ambidexterity means in the world of sport. But in the world of organisations, what it means is that we can actually be two things in the organisation. On the one hand, we can be quite compliant, regulatory, process-driven, bureaucratic, because we need to be. We need to have our systems in place. So yes, we can do that. But on the other hand, literally, on the other hand, we can also be very enterprising. We can also be very risk averse. We can also be very agile. Now, what these two authors are basically saying is that you can cultivate both of those things in your team with a bit of work. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think, let me give you a very practical way that you could set this up in your team that would start the pathway towards ambidexterity. So you get a whiteboard out and you get your team in the room, and what you do is you draw two lines down the whiteboard. So you've basically got three columns: a column on the left, a column on the middle, and a column on the right. So that's the first thing. Now, the column on the left, what you would write there on the column is you would write the words perhaps by the book. In other words, these are things in your team that have to be done by the book. These are things that have to be done in a particular fashion. It might be filling out forms. It could be safety procedures. It could be, how you order materials, whatever it might be. And then you ask the team to consider some of those things, and you write them down. Over on the right-hand side, you then ask the team for all the things that they do day to day that perhaps, and you put the title up the top on the right-hand side, and the title will be free to choose. These are things where people can make decisions for themselves around how they choose to go about their work. Now, you'll find, perhaps interesting enough, that list isn't as long. Because we try and encourage, don't we, in organisations, we encourage people to follow things, to go by the book, because it kind of is a safer route. So you make the list and you encourage people to keep putting things on that list. Now I've got two extremes. I've got the things that have got to be done by the book, and I've got things that can be done, in terms of how I choose to do them. So which leaves the middle column, and the middle column is really the column where you can say to people, what are some things that we do that can actually be done by the book or freedom of choice? In other words, we've got a choice of whether we do one or the other, and we make a list in the middle. Now, just doing that exercise really does hit home the point to your team that you've got choices and where those choices are. So it clarifies in people's mind where you need to follow the book. And of course, it also clarifies with people where you can have freedom of choice. It also perhaps opens up a conversation about some of the things that are in the middle and what do we do about that. So it's a very powerful exercise, and it's a great way of clarifying in the minds of your people what they do. Because if you don't do this, what actually happens is this. In that middle column, remember they've got a choice between doing it by the book or their own way. What people will do without any guidance is they will tend to do it by the book. So what actually happens is that you have more and more people doing things by the book because they want to play it safe. Because if anyone gets into trouble, they can always say, oh, well, I just followed the system. And whereas, of course, if you decide to take a risk and be entrepreneurial about it, it might well be that you make a mistake and then you've got nothing to fall back on except saying that you are chancing your arm. So by doing this, you are giving people some really important clarity around their decision-making processes. So I would strongly recommend giving that a go because you'll find it's quite powerful. Okay. Now, the model I'm going to show you now is a model that I wrote in a book last year called Performance Management for Agile Organizations. Now, this book, one of the reasons I wrote the book is I noticed that people using this word agile all the time. And I'm thinking to myself, do people really know what it means? Do I know what it means? What does it actually mean being agile? Having an agile team, what does it actually mean? So I thought, well, no, I don't think people really do know. I think they know, but I'm not sure they do. So what I designed was a model that would really provided 7 dimensions of agility. So that's what you're looking at the moment. So you can see that around the outside, these 7 dimensions are critical for agility. So I'll go through them briefly with you, but what I suggest you do is start evaluating your team around these 7 dimensions of agility. And I'll guarantee on some of them you might find that you're not doing as well as you'd like. But starting again at 12 o'clock, innovation is about coming up with new ways of doing things. Now, that's not necessarily product related or service related. That could just be the way you do things inside your team. Now, how innovative are you? Is the work do you encourage people to do that? Do they believe that they can be innovative? Maybe they can, maybe they can't. But that's obviously got to be one dimension of agility. Now, processing is an interesting one. This is how quickly you can get things done in your team. So you get a problem or a customer or somebody, whatever you do in your team, you're asked to do something. Then the question is, how quickly can you process that? In other words, how quickly can you turn it around, answer the question, respond to the request, whatever it might be. Now, what about if you could prune some time off that? What about if you could reduce the time somewhat? That would help. And so the question then would be, where could we reduce the amount of time we spend on this activity and get just the same sort of result with less time? Now, the third one's interesting because you make mistakes, I make mistakes, your team makes mistakes, my team makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. However, of course, everyone likes to sweep things under the carpet, don't they? So for a team, it's important to recognize that your team will make mistakes. Now, that's quite liberating. It's not negative, it's just the way it is. And to suggest that people won't ever make mistakes is not real. It will not happen. So the point is that when you make a mistake, both individually and in a team, but we're talking about the team at the moment. So when your team makes a mistake, how quickly is your team able to recover? In other words, how quickly can you turn around the mistake so that you can basically get back to business as usual? A classic example of that would be if you went into a restaurant and ordered a meal, they brought the meal out in 15 minutes, which is fine, but you find that the meal is actually incorrect. So you'd ordered the fish and they brought you the steak. So you ask them if they could fix that up and they come back to you with the right meal within 10 minutes. Now, sure, you probably think it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but you're going to be far more forgiving, are you not? Because they've responded to it quickly. They have recovered quickly. And so it's similar here in your own team, is how quickly can you recover is critically important for getting the result that you want in your team. So that's part of agility. Continuous improvement, as distinct from innovation, is about how we can do things better, faster, easier, safer, with less cost. All of these things are continuous improvement in our team. And I'd be interested to know whether you believe that you've got a continuous improvement culture. Are people always looking for better, faster, and easier ways of achieving the work that they need to do? Because that's part of an agile team. Customer responsiveness, at the end of the day, your team either services customers inside the organization that you belong or external to the organization, or both. And as a result of that, you've got to be, how responsive is your team to the needs and requests of your customers? Is it very inflexible, and is it very process driven, or is it very flexible and very agile to able to deal with those needs and concerns of the customer? So that's critically important for being agile. So we want to be customer responsive. So we also want to be good at problem solving, and we want to be able to solve problems quickly and efficiently and with quality. So this is problem solving has to come into the mixes around what agility looks like. And the final one is changing direction. Now, the changing direction one probably sums up all six. So if you actually look at all six of those, they're all in some respects about changing direction. So when you innovate, obviously you're changing direction. When you're, reducing the processing time, yes, obviously in a sense you're changing direction. When you recover, you obviously have to change direction. Continuous improvement is an incremental change in direction. Customer responsiveness is, of course, often about changing direction, and problem solving may well be to think about other issues and how that might fit in. So what basically the seventh dimension is a summary of all the other six. But you can use this tool to really just have a look at your team and say, where are we doing well and where could we improve, and what can we do in order to make that improvement would be good questions to ask your team. And of course, if you wanted to, you could share that with the team and get them to come up with the answers in collaboration with yourself. All right, so that's agility. That's how I would define agility. And so there's another tool that you might like to use in order to become a more agile team. Now, if you've got any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them into the question box. I'm throwing a lot of information at you, I realize that, but I think you want to take away something with you after this session to go and work on your culture of your team. Now, here's another little activity that is extremely powerful, and I wouldn't underestimate this in any way, shape, or form. I have been using this approach for about 4 or 5 years since I wrote about it in one of my books, The New Influencing Toolkit. I have been absolutely blown away at how incredibly powerful it is. I didn't think it would be when I produced it and designed it, but it is very powerful. And it's based on 4 questions, so a bit like the colour, animal and vehicle. What you do is you ask people to come to a meeting and to respond to 4 key questions. And I'll talk about those in a moment. And you involve yourself as well, but you'll find that the activity will take you about 20-25 minutes. It can be enormously beneficial in a long-lasting way. And if you're really interested in developing a strong, robust culture in your team, you could do a lot worse than producing a team values charter. So the first question is, what is one value that's important to you when working in this team? Now, people may say to you, well, what's this got to do? We've got corporate values, we've got values for this, values for that. Just clarify this with people. These values are only to do with how your team treats each other, nothing else, right? So this is just about your team and how each person treats each other in the team. So I might respond to that question and I might write down the word respect. Okay, so respect is my key thing. I want to be respected in my team. So it's just a label at this stage, doesn't tell us too much. Now, people are writing these things down, so you don't get any feedback until you've completed all 4 questions. Then question 2 is, what's your definition of that value? Now that's important because, for example, respect means different things to different people. So I might say, for example, I write this down, respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they don't agree with their point of view. So that might be my definition of respect. So I've clarified what it is, and I've also clarified what it means. Then we get to question 3, and question 3 is, why is this value important to you? Now this is important because this gives you, the team leader, some great insight into how other people see themselves and others, and maybe even some of their past experiences of working in teams. So I might say to that question, for example, I like to feel that I'm responsible, that I'm respected and my opinions are valued when working with others. Okay, so that's my reason why it's important. Now, question 4, or at least the answer to question 4, is that where the rubber meets the road. Because what I'm asking there is, what behaviours would be consistent with that value? Now, what I might say, if I said respect was my value, I might say, well, not interrupting someone else when they speak would be important in terms of respect. So I write that down. Now, when you've completed the 4 and you've noticed that everyone's got something written down, it's important to write them down because you're going to have to refer back to them later. So I've written them all down, and then I'm going to start by sharing with my team my answers to those 4 questions. So I simply go through and I answer as I've given you the answers there. And then we go round the room and each person shares their answers to questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, you'll find it fascinating. You'll hear a pin drop. It'll be quite illuminating to hear what people have got to say about their values. If you can encourage it, you can even get people to have a conversation about that, or clarification or whatever. But the important thing is everyone shares that information. Now, what you've effectively done at the end of the exercise is that you can take that information and you can create what I would refer to as a team values charter. In other words, it's a list of values that we will hold ourselves as a team accountable for. And remember where the data came from. It came from the team and the team members. And the old adage that people won't argue with their own data is very, very real. So once they have these values set down, you will find this is where the magic happens. You will find that people will tend to adhere to those values. And if they don't adhere to those values for whatever reason, you're in a strong position then to talk to them about that. So you can look at things through the prism of the task that needs to be done, but also through another prism of the values underpinning the way they went about what they did. So it's really powerful. And it's a very, very useful exercise. And then at the end of the exercise, you can, I've actually seen people put plaques on walls with their values. So you get the only thing that goes on the wall is the value and the definition. You don't need the, why it's important and the behaviours, because those things are implicit in the charter. So you put it on the wall, or you can put it on your agenda, or you can put it on your screensavers. Put it wherever you want. But it's a reminder to the team that this is the way we treat each other when we're dealing with each other. You'll find it works extremely well. Even better when people in the team are actually holding themselves accountable, and that becomes very powerful then, because you will find that people in the team will do that. They will actually hold themselves accountable. So give it a go next week. I can assure you, you might think it's risky. It's not risky at all. You'll be amazed because you're actually asking people their opinion. You're actually you're actually inviting people to tell you how they want to be treated. It's not a bad thing, not a bad sort of series of questions to ask, and you'll find you'll get good results. So that's the team values charter. So that's another thing you might like to try. Are there any questions or comments about that, or any observations? Is there anyone that's going to give that a crack next week? Maybe you might want to just make a comment in the question box there and let us know whether you're going to do that or not. Okay, I won't hold you to be accountable for that, but it is certainly worthwhile considering. Now, we're getting close to the end, so we're probably getting through this a little before time, and so we might finish a bit earlier if we don't have any comments or questions. But if you've got comments, questions, now's the time to ask. I did mention at the outset that I was going to share with you my team identity model from my new book, which is hopefully coming out next year. And we have, so all teams have identities. Some of these teams have very clear identities. So, you look at sporting teams like the All Blacks, or, you look at, military teams like the SAS. They all have, these teams have very clear, strong identities. People can sort of, it's very clear what they stand for. So how do you build an identity of your team working perhaps in a larger organization where there are lots of teams? So what can you do? Well, in my view, there are 3 strategies that you can adopt to build a team identity. And I've just made them easy they all start with B. There's buffering, building, and bridging. So let me go through each of those and explain them in a little bit more detail for you. So buffering, and by its nature, buffering is actually creating a buffer between your team and external influences that are negative to the team. So to a certain extent, a leader has to protect the resources of the team, whether they're financial, whether they're human, technical, whatever. Because what you will find in a large organization is that teams will tend to be cannibalized by others, sometimes unintentionally, but there are people who will be destructive forces for your team. Now, there's a fine line here, obviously. If you shut up shop and you put boundaries around the team so no one can enter physically or psychologically, that's actually not going to be very helpful for you, because obviously you will need the help of other people beyond the team. But to a certain extent, if you don't do it, then you are at the whim of people to sabotage your team, and they will. It's just human nature. So buffering is all about putting a reasonable buffer between your team and its resources and capabilities and some of the unwanted advances from outside the team. So, for example, you have a spare computer in your team, you've got a new person starting in a month, right? It's all set up there, but because no one's using it, you might have somebody putting a forceful argument that they need that computer because they've got someone there already. And then of course you suffer because when the new person starts, they don't have a computer on their desk. So these sorts of things happen all the time. So there's a fair degree of need to buffer. Now, the second one, bridging, is exactly the opposite of buffering. So this is about reaching out to the stakeholders that you require in order to get the job done in your team. So one of the most important stakeholders external to your team, of course, is your boss. So without his or her support, your team's going nowhere. So obviously they would be a critical stakeholder, and you probably have the primary responsibility of reaching out to that person. But there are other stakeholders within your organisation and perhaps outside the organisation that are also important to the team's livelihood. So bridging is a process of actually reaching out and building healthy, robust working relationships with key stakeholders to make sure that you can deliver what you promised to deliver. Now, of course, you can overdo that as well, but obviously if you've got buffering happening on the one hand and you've got bridging happening on the other, you are sharpening that team identity and making it a much more efficient and effective process. And the final one is building, and building is exactly what we're talking about today. Building is building a team culture, and it's about creating a strong entity within how we do things, an ethos, and something that we can all buy into, whether it's a team values charter or changing the culture collectively or whatever it might be that we've run through today. So buffering, bridging, and building. So buffering is an internal process. Well, it's actually internal and external. Bridging is definitely an external process, and building is definitely an internal process. So buffering is internal, external. Bridging is definitely external, and building is definitely internal. So maybe that might help you think about a little strategy around how you can build your team identity around those three perspectives. Obviously, my book talks about those in great detail. All right, so any questions, comments, observations at this stage? No? All good? Okay. Well, we're pretty close to the end. Now, what I want to do is give you a little bit of homework to do. And of course, you can imagine that the homework is very much around that implementing a team culture strategy. So I've thrown a lot of things at you today. I don't expect that you're going to do them all. It'd probably be unrealistic to do them all. But I want you to select something that resonated with you, whether it was the team values charter, the animal, the colour and the vehicle, whether it was the agile, whether it was about becoming more agile, whether it's becoming more ambidextrous, whatever came up for you today, I want you to actually make a commitment personally to go out and do that perhaps next week, before you forget about it, because you won't be seeing me again for, well, not in this series at least. So that's your homework, and I want you to have a go at that and give it a really good shot. Which brings us to the end, and I just wanted to thank everyone very much for the opportunity of working with you. It's been an enjoyable series. I think we've had a lot of feedback. We've had a lot of interesting comments. We've had, we've had guest speakers. We've had all sorts of things happen. Thank you, everyone. I think it's had a high rate of interest as well. Now, a quick plug, because I won't see you again. You'll notice that on your screen there's a new Lunch and Learn, and you'll notice that this is a different emphasis. This is a management Lunch and Learn. So this is more working as a manager rather than a team member. So if you decided that you wanted to do more of this, here's your opportunity. We've got a new one starting on the 6th of September. It's the same price, $297 $95 per person. GST inclusive, and of course you know what you get for all that, so I'm not going to explain all that, but it's different topics and a different emphasis. So if you're not interested, okay, good on you, but if someone else in your team or maybe in the organisation's interested, can you let people know, because I'm taking registrations for that right now, and I'd like to book that one up as quickly as I can. So that's about it from me. Thank you for allowing me to give you that plug, and thanks everyone, and I hope you got something really useful. I'm always interested in feedback, so if you want to give me some feedback and send me some comments or whatever about what you liked or perhaps what needed to change, I'm always open to that. And you've got my email address, tim@winnersatwork.com.au. All right, well, that's it from me. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and yeah, look forward to hearing any war stories, and I look forward to hearing, your success in your team. Thank you for devoting a fair chunk of your time to this series, and I hope you got something really useful out of it. Thank you, and all the best, and goodbye.